A year into the Saudi-led coalition's bombing campaign in Yemen and 5 years into the kingdom's involvement in the Syrian civil war, what's Saudi Arabia's endgame? I'll ask its ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Abdullah Al-Muallami. Ambassador Muallami, thank you very much for joining me on UpFront. Why over the past year has Saudi Arabia, your country, the Middle East's richest country, led a coalition of Arab states in bombing the Middle East's poorest country, Yemen?
Thank you very much for having me. And let's rephrase the introduction. We are not there to bomb Yemen. We are there to help the Yemeni people restore law and order in that country, restore the legitimate government of Yemen, and exercise our own right of self-defense against the threats to our own security. So that is why we are in Yemen. We are in Yemen upon the invitation of the Yemeni government, upon the request of the Yemeni people, and we are there to help Yemen restore its legitimate status.
And when you talk about threats coming out of Yemen, presumably you're referring to the Houthis?
To the Houthis and to their backers, yes.
And those you see as a threat not just to Yemen but to Saudi Arabia?
Of course, of course. We have had continuous bombardment across the border into our own cities and towns. We have had close to 400 civilian casualties, deaths in Saudi cities and villages alongside the border. And of course, we cannot accept the presence of a military militia that is outside the control of the state right at our borders.
So you're against the Houthis. In the summer of 2014...
We're not against the Houthis. We are with the Yemeni people.
Okay.
It's the Houthis who have tried to overtake...
Houthis are also Yemeni people?
Well, they are the Yemeni people, but they have tried to overtake the will of the Yemeni people.
Okay.
So we are in support of the Yemeni people.
In the summer of 2014, when Gaza was being pounded by the Israeli Air Force, the then Saudi King Abdullah condemned the bombardment as a collective massacre. What would you say to those who say that militarily what you're doing in Yemen today isn't that different to what Israel did in Gaza? They said that they were bombing Hamas, not the Palestinians, but they kill civilians. Yeah. You say you're bombing the Houthis, not Yemenis, but you're killing civilians too, according to the UN.
No, that's preposterous. There's a huge difference between the two situations. First of all, the Israelis in Gaza are exercising occupation and siege.
Agreed.
And so forth.
The politics are very different. I'm talking about the actual
politics are
bombing
different, the justification
and the killing of
is
civilians
different.
in the process from the air.
The Israelis are bombing irrespective of civilian casualties, irrespective of civilian positions. Our own exercise of military force is conducted against military targets. There may be collateral damage occasionally, there may be some mistakes occasionally, but there is absolutely no comparison. And in Gaza, over a period of several weeks, they created almost 1,500 casualties, 1,500 people dead. The number is
in Yemen, 6,000 are dead.
Over a year.
6,000 are dead, 3,000 civilians. 60% of those civilians' casualties, according to a UN humanitarian report, came from airstrikes, from Saudi-led coalition airstrikes. Look, because the Houthis don't have any airplanes bombing. It's the Saudis and its allies that are bombing.
Every single life in Yemen or anywhere else is valuable. But having said that, when you say that there are 6,000 casualties, deaths in Yemen, first of all, the vast majority of these deaths have been caused by the arbitrary shelling of the Houthis.
That's not what the UN report last year said.
That's not what the UN report...
60% of the civilian casualties, according to a report from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, were from airstrikes. The Houthis don't do airstrikes. Only the Saudis and its allies do airstrikes.
Correct. But the percentage that is quoted is absolutely wrong. There is no foundation for it. I do not know the source of your report, but there is absolutely no foundation for it.
Figures came from the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has a team of trained human rights officers and field monitors located in almost all the conflict-affected areas of Yemen.
No, that's not true.
That's what the UN is saying. You're the ambassador to the UN.
That's not true.
So the UN is lying?
I'm not saying they're lying.
You just said they're not true.
That's not true. Okay. I'm saying that they do not have the ability to make these determinations. Look, the vast majority of the deaths have been caused by arbitrary shelling.
What's your source
Arbitrary shelling, first of all, common sense, because when you fire arbitrary mortar fire against a civilian quarter, you kill everybody in line.
No one's disputing, and I think the same human rights groups who have criticised your government have also criticised Houthis for arbitrarily shelling civilians. The point is they've also criticised you for using cluster bombs, banned under international law, for bombing an Oxfam warehouse, refugee camps, weddings, buses, marketplaces. This is from the UN panel of experts report, from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch.
To start with, by their admission, the panel of experts admitted that they did not set foot in Yemen, admitted that they did not have the resources, human or otherwise, to provide an accurate account. They gave their best estimates. It happens that they are wrong on their best estimates. Secondly, most of that has been proven to be absolutely wrong, that it did not happen.
Proven by who?
They accused us by the United Nations, by other independent observers, by independent
Hold on, I've
embassies.
quoted you 2 UN reports. You said they're not accurate, and then you said the UN has debunked those reports. Which UN official has debunked his own report?
What I'm saying is that they accused us, for example, of bombing a historic site in Sana'a. It turned out that that was not bombed at all by any airstrikes. It was the victim of artillery shelling. The same thing happened, the so-called wedding was nothing but a gathering spot for military training for the Houthis.
And what about when Amnesty International, you say the UN experts weren't on the ground? Amnesty International say they visited the governorate of Sada to look at 13 strikes in May, June and July, and they say that 100 civilians were killed, 55 children and 22 women killed in the space of 3 months.
Amnesty International is not a UN organization. Amnesty
It's a very respected human rights organization.
I'm not sure about that. It's an organization that has a record of criticizing everyone.
Which makes them fair.
Well, no, not necessarily. They have a record of criticizing Saudi Arabia in particular, unfoundedly.
Well, here they're saying they went on the ground into Sada. You complain the UN didn't go in. Amnesty went in. This is what they're saying they found.
What did they find?
They're saying that they found that over the space of 3 months, the coalition declared that the Sada area, a military target, killed up to 100 civilians, 55 children, 22 women, injured a further 56, including 18 children. Well, the youngest child killed was just 12 days old.
Let's not get into a game of numbers here.
You asked me the dates.
Let's not get into a game of numbers. Any civilian casualty is a casualty too many. And I'm not saying that mistakes may have not happened or collateral damage may have not happened. But it is our plan in conducting the war to be as precise as we possibly can in targeting military targets.
Why use cluster bombs, Ambassador?
We are not. We are not. I'm denying that.
Your own spokesman said in January on CNN that you used cluster bombs last year.
Our own spokesman acknowledged the use of cluster bombs only once in hitting a purely military target.
So you have used cluster bombs?
Once, using, and by the way, Saudi Arabia is not a member of the treaty that bans the cluster bombs, just like the United States is not, just like many other countries are not. So using cluster bombs against a military target, there is nothing in terms of international treaties that prevent us from doing so. We have not used cluster bombs at all in terms of the war in Yemen, maybe with the exception of this particular case that you're referring to.
Well, the human rights groups that you question, they say you have. But when will this war be over, do you think? When do you think we'll have a political resolution?
I hope tomorrow. I hope tomorrow. I hope today. As soon as the Houthis acknowledge their acceptance of Resolution 2216, which has been endorsed by the Security Council almost unanimously, as soon as they declare their readiness to implement it.
But if they don't, military action continues indefinitely.
Well, if they don't, it means they're defying the world, they're defying their
own government. Maybe they are. I'm asking what Saudi Arabia plans to do. Continue military action indefinitely?
Well, we will continue the process of helping the Yemeni government conduct what it needs to conduct to restore its legitimacy. If they ask us to continue the military campaign, of course we will. But we are exercising every effort possible to engage in a political dialogue, and we will continue to open our arms and our hearts to the possibility of dialogue with everybody.
In Yemen, you're supporting, as you say, the government against the rebels. In Syria, you're supporting the rebels against the government. What is your end game in Syria? We know you want Assad to go. Saudi Arabia said they want Bashar al-Assad to leave office. But what or who would you like to see take his place? What's the political alternative?
The Syrian people.
In what shape or form?
In any shape or form that the Syrian people agree for themselves and decide for themselves.
So elections, for example?
Elections, yes.
Because the foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, said recently there is a political process to open the way for elections. So you want to see an elected government in Syria after Assad goes?
Well, yes, that's the process that is that we hope will take place in Syria.
So many people might say that's a good thing. There should be democracy in Syria. There should be an elected government in Syria. But they might also wonder, why are you okay with an elected government in Syria, but not an elected government in Saudi Arabia? If the people of Syria get to choose their own rulers or head of state, why can't the people of Saudi Arabia choose their own head of state?
Go and ask the people of Saudi Arabia, are you happy with your... Of course you can.
No, it's illegal in Saudi Arabia to call for a change in the government, to call for the king to come
I didn't say go and call for a change of government. Okay. I said go and call and ask the Saudi people whether they are happy with their system of government.
How do I do that? What's the process?
In any way you want. In any way you want. Opinion polls, anything.
What about an election?
And you will find, well, we will have elections at some point of time. We've started with municipal elections. But elections is not the panacea for everything.
No, I agree. But you said you want elections in Syria. I'm saying why not have elections in Saudi as well?
Well, just because there are elections in Syria doesn't mean there have to be elections somewhere else. I said elections, and you agreed, is not a panacea for everything. The key question is the population content and happy and satisfied with the form of government that they have? And I would like to claim that if you went to Saudi Arabia and if you conducted a survey in Saudi Arabia in any way, official, formal, otherwise, you will find a high degree of support for the system of government in Saudi Arabia.
Isn't that partly because if they do say they don't want this government, they want another government, they'll go to jail?
No.
It's against the law in Saudi Arabia to call for a change in the system of government.
But that's not the issue. The issue
that is the issue.
No, it's not.
How can I, as a Saudi, say I want a different system of government if it's illegal for me to say that?
I'm saying that if there was a way by which you can ask the common people in the street, anonymously, privately, anyway.
It's called voting.
Well, voting along the lines of Western democracy is not necessarily...
No, along the lines of whatever you want in Syria.
Okay, well, I mean, even that is not the solution for a system of government. What is important is the pact between the governed and the governor, the mutual acceptance. I can tell you that mutual acceptance is much higher in Saudi Arabia than in almost any other country in the world. Saudi Arabia did not kill 300,000 people.
Agreed.
Saudi Arabia did not impose a rule by force and by displacing 12 million people from their country. So there is absolutely no comparison.
Coming back to the Syrian conflict, as you mentioned, barbaric crimes committed there, millions of people have left their homes, Bashar al-Assad has a lot to answer for. How do you, on the other side of that conflict, justify supporting what have been called quote-unquote jihadist groups fighting against Assad? You've supported the Army of Conquest, Jaish al-Fatah, which is an umbrella group of rebels that includes also Jabhat al-Nusra, which is, of course, al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. Your critics say, see, Saudi Arabia is sponsoring, quote, violent extremism in Syria and elsewhere.
We do not support Jabhat al-Nusra. As far as we're concerned, we've declared Jabhat al-Nusra to be a terrorist organization long before anybody else did. The same thing applies to Daesh. So we do not support terrorist organizations.
No, I'm asking the question specifically about Jaish al-Fatah, which is an umbrella of rebel groups, which Saudi Arabia supports. Jabhat al-Nusra is a member of that group. So
we do not support Jabhat al-Nusra.
But you support a group that Jabhat al-Nusra is part of.
We support other groups.
Agreed. But you also support a group that Jabhat al-Nusra is part of.
We do not support Jabhat al-Nusra, period.
Do you support Jaish al-Fatah?
I don't know about Jaish al-Fatah.
The Army of Conquest.
We do not support any organization that is declared a terrorist organization by the United Nations.
You mentioned Daesh or ISIL. There is this constant accusation from some critics of Saudi Arabia that the kingdom or people in the kingdom have been funding ISIL, although there hasn't been any evidence really produced for that specific claim. But there is this other related accusation that the kingdom and ISIL share, if not a financial relationship, then an ideological relationship, that in terms of attitude towards women or Jews or Shias or Christians, in terms of beheadings, there are these similarities between Saudi Arabia and ISIL.
That's the most ridiculous. That's the most ridiculous assertion. Absolutely, there is absolutely no similarity between Daesh and Saudi Arabia in whatsoever. They claim They claim to be Muslims, but they are as far away from Islamic teachings as one can ever be. Saudi Arabia is a country that is Islamic, that is Muslim. We are proud of our Sharia heritage. We are proud of our system of government, of our judicial. But there is absolutely no way that you can compare the two together. We have no problem. You mentioned Shias and Christians and others. Of course, we have no problem with any of these groups. Shias are equal citizens. They have the same rights.
Amnesty International, who I know you don't like, say discrimination against the Shia minority remains entrenched in Saudi Arabia.
Amnesty International is not a credible source of information. A credible source of information would be going to Saudi Arabia and meeting the Shias themselves and meeting the population at large and finding out that we live next to each other, have lived next to each other for centuries, and we do not see any evidence of any such difficulties or problems.
You say there are no similarities whatsoever on this subject. Can you explain to our viewers who see that Saudi Arabia, according to rights groups, has executed more than 150 people, I think, in 2015, the highest level for 2 decades, many of them via beheadings. Can you explain to our viewers, to our global audience, what is the difference between a Saudi beheading and an ISIL beheading?
Well, first of all, the beheading is, what is the difference between the two is the process that leads to that.
What about the act?
No, I mean, putting somebody to death by beheading or by other forms of killing is irrelevant.
It's not barbaric in your view?
Of course not. Of course not. It's not barbaric. It is a method of implementing a judicial ruling that has taken place. So the action of or the methodology used is irrelevant. What is important is the process. In Saudi Arabia, there are no beheadings without a full process of law behind them. What you are referring to or describing in Daesh is arbitrary and barbaric.
So your Saudi Arabia's problem with ISIL is not the act of beheading, it's the way they got to the beheading.
No, I'm saying that the way they get to the beheading is the key issue, whether it is for Saudi Arabia.
So you don't object to the beheadings themselves of ISIL?
Of course we object to them. Of course we object to them. I mean, are you telling me that if Daesh shot them by a rifle instead of beheading them, that would make it right?
No, but
You're not saying
it would be less worse. I think most people would agree.
I don't think so. Okay. I think it would be just equally wrong. So the issue is not the beheading. The issue is the process.
And you follow a judicial process.
Of course.
On the subject of your allies in the United States, speaking at a think tank in DC last year, former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, possibly the next president of the United States, said much of the extremism in the world today is the direct result of policies and funding undertaken by the Saudi government and individuals. We would be foolish not to recognize that. That's a pretty damning assessment from one of your closest allies, a politician whose foundation Saudi royals have donated to.
We have the highest respect for Mrs. Clinton. If she had said this statement, then she would be dead wrong, because the linkage between terrorism and between the pure philosophy of Islam is totally non-existent and is totally a product, and that's what the terrorists want us to believe.
But this is not about Islam. This is about Saudi's links. Saudi is not Islam. Saudi Arabia is not Islam.
Well,
one country in the Muslim world.
Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. We take pride in our representation of Islamic values, of Islamic heritage, of Islamic tradition, of Islamic Sharia, and we are proud of that.
So when Hillary Clinton or Obama or someone says that there's links between Saudi Arabia and extremism, they're serving the terrorist agenda?
I think anybody who claims that there is a link between Islam and terrorism...
No, that's not what I asked. I said if they link Saudi Arabia to extremism.
I'm saying that anybody who links Islam to terrorism is not serving Islam
and I agree with you on that subject.
And is going along...
I'm asking about Saudi Arabia.
The terrorist rhetoric. Anybody who links Saudi Arabia with terrorism would be equally wrong.
Ambassador Moallemi, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
How do you defeat the brutal Somali group Al-Shabaab? Earlier this month, the US used both manned aircraft and drones to kill more than 150 suspected Al-Shabaab fighters. But do such airstrikes create more enemies than they kill? To debate this, I'm joined by Abu Kar Arman, Somalia's former special envoy to the US, who has said drone strikes are a priceless propaganda tool for Al-Shabaab, and from Nairobi, Ahmed Abdessalam Aden, Somalia's former deputy prime minister, who is a supporter of such strikes. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Ahmed Abdessalam Aden, I want to begin by asking you this. In 2012, you were almost killed, I believe, by an Al-Shabaab suicide bomber in Somalia. 2 members of parliament were murdered in that attack. I'm guessing you don't shed any tears when Americans attack Al-Shabaab fighters with drones.
No, but it's more than me. It's the fact that this problem has been ongoing for the last several years in Somalia, and it is a problem that was brought to Somalia, not Somalis who went out and found Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab came to Somalia and with the intent to destroy it. And I think that's why I believe we have to use every mechanism that we have to fight them. The fact that the drones are targeting the leadership and they cannot organize as much as they want, that in itself is useful. But this is a war. I mean, we cannot just sit idly and say, you know, this is a propaganda for Shabaab. Shabab are there, propaganda or otherwise.
Okay.
They are here to destroy the Somali people.
Abu Bakr Arman, it's a war. You have to kill your enemies, regardless of whatever propaganda value they may take from the way you kill them.
Shabab needs to be taken out. Nobody questions that. Everybody wants to do that. They wreak havoc, whether it is in Somalia, whether it is in East Africa, or throughout the world. Now they're going transnational. The issue is, what are the causing elements that really perpetuate this problem? That is the key issue. 2007, with all due respect, we had maximum of 2,000 al-Shabaab. And I have written extensively about that. You can
So
go
you think
back
the numbers have
that.
increased?
The numbers definitely increased.
And then what is the cause? In your view, what's the cause?
Than they were before.
And what's in your
There's
view
no
the
question.
cause? And what's in your view the cause
Well,
of those
the
numbers going up?
causes are many. You have people who are 70% of that population, of the Somali population, youth, are not employed. These guys provide them monthly payments, cell phones and all of that. If I may,
very briefly.
Yeah, and then you have and clans who are historically oppressed, who have grievances against
So you want to
the
focus
clan
on the grievances
dominance
as a way of fighting our
Sure, you have to understand who you're dealing with first.
Ahmed Abdulsalam Aden, you want to come back
Let
in?
me interject. We've done this. I was, as a member of the Somali government at that time, as the leader of the peace process, I was the one who offered not just the Shabab, any Somali who was against the Somali government, any clan who had grievance. That's why we had the Djibouti peace process. Shabab did not come for grievance. Shabab did not come because there is an Islamic issue. Shabab came as an international jihadist organization. It's an extremist organization. This is an organized, motivated, well-resourced organization that's fighting us.
Clans with grievances have left al-Shabaab to join the government. They were not even sure if the government was going to compromise that decision of theirs.
Do you think that was a good decision?
So what they decided was to go to AMISOM and surrender to AMISOM.
African Union military
Those
force in Somalia.
450 members of al-Shabaab left. They were not because they were hardcore Shabaab. They were clans who had
So you would like to
grievances.
see more of that?
I would like to see more
peeling
of
away
that.
the people who are not hardcore.
Absolutely.
And do you think that al-Shabaab is a product of governmental failure? Have the Somali political ruling class, people like Ahmed Abdulsalam Aden, do you fault him and people like him for creating this problem?
Oh, most definitely. The period that the minister is talking about is the period that the Ethiopian occupation took place in Somalia. 20,000, this is the conservative estimate, Somalis were killed in there under that occupation. Human rights violations left and right that are well documented both by Human Rights Watch and
that
Amnesty.
boosted al-Shabaab in your view?
Of course.
Okay,
that is part of the narrative that they
Okay, well,
operate
let the former Deputy Prime Minister come back in.
Yes, go ahead.
That period is when we facilitated the exit of Ethiopian troops out of Somalia. That is when we had an agreement in Djibouti, when we provided all the facilities to those who were fighting us.
With all due respect, there was no such thing as a facilitation of Ethiopian exit.
Okay. Before we argue over the Ethiopian intervention from almost a decade ago, Ahmed Abdulsalam Aden, deal with the broader point before we finish, that this is a failure of governance in Somalia, that politicians, ministers have let down the Somali people, and you, rightly or wrongly, are part of that political class.
No, I disagree with that. That's not the case. This is the failure of, Somalia has been without a government for 20 years. It created a vulnerable space for extremists to come and to organize in Somalia. That's why they are fighting Somalis. That's why they're taking advantage of the weakness of Somalis had without a government. When you talk about political Somalis had no government, had no politicians. Somalis had no institutions. That is what allowed them to come to the country. What's happening now is a fragile situation where the Somali governments, successive governments, are trying to bring back normalcy and institutions.
Okay, we're about to run out of time. We're about to run out of time. One last question to you both. Do you think al-Shabaab will be beaten anytime soon? Abu Bakr Arman.
They're not going to be beaten if you don't have a true reconciliation in Somalia. You're not going to have a true reconciliation in Somalia as long as AMISOM is there, because Ethiopia is part of course. Ethiopia is part of that, and it does not see in their best interest to have united Somalia that really functions as one entity.
Ahmed Abdulsalam Aden, is al-Shabaab going to be beaten anytime soon?
I don't want to respond to conspiracy theories. What I know is today al-Shabaab are fighting in Puntland where there's no AMISOM force, where there's no Ethiopian force, where there's no one. They went there to this peaceful community and the Somalis will defeat them, and they have already defeated them.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.